It was a crisp October morning in 1929 when the streets of New York seemed to hum with an unusual tension. The air was sharp, the kind that bites at your cheeks, but what really froze people in place was not the chill. It was the whisper traveling through the city like a cold wind. Something was happening on Wall Street. Men in wool suits and fedora hats hurried toward the New York Stock Exchange. Women clutched newspapers with headlines about record highs in the market. Only weeks before, it seemed as if the entire nation had been drunk on prosperity. From the factories of Detroit to the small-town diners in Kansas, everyone believed the boom would never end. But that morning, the faces told another story. Brokers walked quickly, their brows furrowed. Outside the exchange, the crowd had already begun to gather. They leaned in, straining to catch any fragment of news. Inside the grand, echoing hall of the exchange, the opening bell rang. For a moment, the usual chaos erupted, the shouts, the hand signals, the scribbled notes. But then, like a storm front sweeping in, a wave of sell orders hit the floor. Stocks that had seemed untouchable began to slip. The ticker tape printed a blur of numbers that fell faster than anyone could read them. The first hour felt like watching a grand ocean liner scrape against an iceberg. Slow at first, then unstoppable. Fortunes vanished in minutes. Men who had walked in smiling stood pale and silent, gripping the edges of their desks as if holding on could stop the fall. No one knew it yet, but that day, October 29th, 1929, would come to be called Black Tuesday, and it would mark the beginning of the darkest economic chapter in American history. By mid-morning, the sound inside the New York Stock Exchange was unlike anything witnesses had ever heard. It was no longer the confident roar of business, but a frantic, almost desperate clamor. The shouts overlapped, voices cracking under the strain. Paper littered the floor like autumn leaves, torn tickets and crumpled orders tossed aside in the panic. In the visitors' gallery, ordinary citizens, clerks, farmers, shopkeepers, pressed themselves against the railing, their knuckles white. Many had traveled from far outside the city just to watch the market, proud owners of shares they believed would make them wealthy. Now they stared in disbelief as the value of those shares melted away in real time. One man in a brown overcoat muttered under his breath, "It'll bounce back." It has to. But each new number from the ticker tape seemed to slap him across the face. Another man simply took off his hat and held it in his hands, as if standing at a funeral. Outside, the sidewalks swelled with anxious crowds. Rumors moved faster than any newswire, banks failing, millionaires ruined, factories preparing to close. Messengers darted through the mob with envelopes, while reporters scribbled furiously into notepads, their pencils breaking under the pressure. Across the nation, telegraph lines carried the tremors outward. In Chicago, in St. Louis, in tiny farming towns in Iowa, stockholders gathered in front of brokerage office windows where the latest prices were posted. A woman in her 40s fainted on the street after reading that her life savings in railroad shares had been cut to a fraction. The market had seen drops before, but never like this. It was not a storm, it was an avalanche. And as each minute passed, the realization spread. This was not just the loss of money. This was the collapse of trust. The morning after Black Tuesday, New York awoke to a silence that felt heavier than the noise of the crash itself. Newspapers hit the sidewalks with headlines screaming in bold type, "Market collapses, billions lost." The word billions felt almost unreal to most Americans, an abstract giant they could barely imagine. But they understood loss. They understood fear. On Wall Street, the cobblestones were damp from an overnight rain. The crowds were smaller now, not because the interest had faded, but because many simply could not bear to watch anymore. Those who came stood quietly, their eyes drawn toward the exchange as though expecting it to burst into flames. In small towns far from the city, the news traveled slower, but its impact was no less sharp. Farmers opened their morning papers to read that their modest stock investments, shares bought with the hope of paying for new equipment or sending a child to college, had all but evaporated. Store owners saw the fear in the faces of their customers and began wondering how long before sales would vanish entirely. In Washington, politicians tried to speak with calm authority. They called the crash a correction, insisting that the fundamentals of the economy were still sound. But in private, behind closed doors, the tone was darker. Advisors spoke in hushed voices about the chain reaction that might follow. Failing banks, vanishing jobs, entire industries collapsing like houses of cards. Some investors clung to hope, believing the market would recover in weeks. Others quietly began to liquidate what little they had left. And for millions who had never owned a single share, there was a dawning realization. This was not just a problem for the wealthy. This storm would touch every home in America. By November, the shockwaves of Black Tuesday had begun to ripple far beyond Wall Street. Banks, once seen as unshakable pillars of American life, started to tremble. At first, it was just a few small-town institutions in the Midwest, the kind where the teller knew every customer by name. A whisper would spread, "The bank is in trouble." And that whisper was enough. People lined up before sunrise, desperate to withdraw their savings before it was too late. For many, savings meant the careful accumulation of years. The money set aside for a wedding, the funds to buy a farm, or the cushion for hard winters. But when too many hands reached into the vault at once, the vault emptied. Doors were locked. Notices appeared in windows, closed until further notice. In the cities, businesses began to fail. Factories cut shifts, then closed altogether. In Detroit, automobile assembly lines went quiet, the clanging of metal replaced by an eerie stillness. In Chicago, meatpacking plants laid off hundreds overnight. In New York, once bustling department stores stood nearly empty. Families who had never considered themselves poor suddenly faced hard choices. Rent or food, coal for the stove, or shoes for the children. The shame of asking for credit at the corner store became a quiet, daily humiliation. And all the while, the newspapers printed cautious optimism. The recovery is near, but the truth seeped into every conversation. A storm was here, and it was only getting stronger. On a cold December morning in a small Kansas town, Farmer Samuel Hayes stood at the edge of his barren field. Just a year earlier, these acres had been gold with wheat. Now the soil lay dry and cracked, the wind scattering dust across the horizon. The bank had taken back 2 of his tractors when he could no longer keep up with the payments. His wife, Clara, stood on the porch, clutching a letter from their eldest son. He had left for Chicago to find work, though rumors said there was none to be found. Hundreds of miles away, in the heart of New York City, 28-year-old Thomas Carter climbed the marble steps of the brokerage firm where he once handled trades worth thousands of dollars. He no longer wore a crisp new suit. The jacket was frayed at the cuffs, the shoes scuffed from weeks of walking rather than taking the subway. Inside, the once lively trading floor felt hollow. The shouting and ringing bells were gone, replaced by the slow shuffle of clerks packing files into boxes. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment in Cleveland, Margaret Lewis counted coins at her kitchen table. A widow with 2 small children, she had been relying on a part-time sewing job at a textile factory. That morning, her supervisor had told her the factory would close for a short while. But Margaret knew, from the look in his eyes, that a short while could mean forever. These 3 lives, separated by miles and circumstance, were bound together by a single thread. The collapse of an economy they could not control, yet that controlled every detail of their days. By the winter of 1930, the streets of America had changed. In New York, once bustling avenues now echoed with the sound of footsteps as people lined up outside soup kitchens. Men in worn coats and flat caps clutched tin cups, their breath clouding the freezing air. Some stood silently, staring at the ground. Others whispered in low voices about rumors of jobs that almost never turned out to be real. Breadlines stretched for blocks. Charities, overwhelmed and underfunded, could only do so much. In Chicago, a church hall served thin soup to hundreds every day, but supplies ran out before noon. Those at the end of the line often walked away empty-handed, shoulders slumped, the cold biting at their ears. Children wore shoes patched with cardboard, their toes numb from the snow. Families burned furniture for warmth. The price of coal, though lower than before, was still too much for many without an income. The city skyline remained the same, but the life beneath it had altered completely, like a grand stage where the lights had dimmed and the actors had forgotten their lines. And then came the protests. In Washington, veterans of the Great War marched to demand early payment of the bonuses they had been promised. These were men who had once served their country with pride, now standing in ragged uniforms, faces hardened by hunger and humiliation. They camped near the Capitol, refusing to leave, their presence a living reminder of the human cost of economic collapse. The air was heavy, not only with cold, but with something deeper, a shared fear that the country might never recover. To understand why the Great Depression cut so deep, you have to picture the economy as a web, a delicate network of threads connecting banks, businesses, workers, and farms. When one thread snapped, others followed. It began with the banks. In the Roaring '20s, many banks had poured people's savings into the stock market. When the crash came, the value of those investments evaporated. Some banks closed their doors immediately. Others tried to hold on, but without cash to lend, businesses couldn't borrow to keep running. Factories slowed down production. Orders stopped coming in. Workers were laid off, not in hundreds, but in tens of thousands. Those without jobs stopped buying goods. Farmers, already struggling with falling crop prices, found no buyers at all. Wheat rotted in fields while children in cities went hungry. It was a vicious circle. Fewer jobs meant fewer purchases, which meant more businesses failing, which led to even more job losses. The government's early response was hesitant. Many leaders believed the economy would self-correct, as it had in smaller recessions before. But this was no ordinary downturn, it was a spiral. The old rules no longer worked. The fear was contagious. Even people who still had money hoarded it, hiding cash in cupboards or sewing it into the lining of coats. Trust, the invisible force that keeps economies alive, was disappearing. And without trust, even the strongest web begins to unravel. By the early 1930s, America was a nation bruised and unsteady. Breadlines stretched for blocks, farmers abandoned their land, and headlines carried grim news day after day. Yet, in the midst of this darkness, faint sparks of hope began to appear. In 1932, a new voice rose above the despair: Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His speeches were calm but powerful, promising a new deal for the American people. He didn't speak in complicated economic terms. Instead, he talked about courage, unity, and action. When Roosevelt took office in 1933, he moved fast. Banks were closing every day, and panic was spreading. His first act was to declare a bank holiday, shutting down all banks temporarily to stop the chaos. Many feared this was the end, but Roosevelt addressed the nation directly over the radio, explaining his plan in plain language. People listened. For the first time in years, they felt that someone was steering the ship. When banks reopened, deposits actually increased, proof that trust, once shattered, could slowly be rebuilt. Roosevelt's New Deal programs put men back to work, building roads, bridges, and schools. Farmers received support to keep their land. The government became not just a distant power in Washington, but an active hand in the daily survival of its citizens. It wasn't an instant recovery. There were still years of struggle ahead. But for the first time since that terrible October day in 1929, Americans began to believe that the future could be better than the present. The Great Depression did not end overnight. It stretched through most of the 1930s and only truly faded when America entered the Second World War. But its scars never disappeared. They remained as quiet warnings etched into the nation's memory. It taught Americans that unchecked speculation, blind optimism, and ignoring warning signs can lead to disaster. It showed that an economy is not just numbers on paper. It is made of real people with real fears, hopes, and lives that can be shattered in an instant. The stock market crash of October 29, 1929, proved that confidence is fragile. Once broken, it takes years to rebuild. Yet it also revealed something else: the resilience of a nation that refuses to stay down. Today, we live in a world that moves faster than ever. Markets rise and fall in seconds. News spreads instantly across the globe. And while technology has changed, human nature has not. Greed still tempts, fear still paralyzes, and history still whispers warnings for those willing to listen. The lesson is simple, but urgent. Pay attention to the signs, remember the past, and never believe that it could never happen again. Because the truth is, it can, and it will if we forget. The Great Depression is not just a story of numbers and charts. It is a story of people. People who woke up one morning thinking their future was certain, and by nightfall, found themselves standing in a different world. And perhaps the greatest reminder it leaves us with is this: in the face of collapse, the strength of a nation lies not in its wealth, but in its unity, its courage, and its ability to adapt.